You might think pirates spent most of their nights plotting dazzling heists under the moonlight or singing raucous sea shanties around a fire. But their biggest enemy wasn't the Royal Navy or rival buccaneers. It was freezing cold nights aboard their ships. Picture this. You're cramped on a wooden vessel in the middle of the Atlantic in the late 1700s, temperatures dropping well below freezing, and no heated cabins or fluffy duvets in sight. Now, if you thought pirates just wrapped themselves in their prized silk scarves or huddled together like a bunch of cuddly kittens, think again. The real struggle was how to keep those scurvy-ridden bones warm enough to survive the night without losing fingers or toes to frostbite. Let me tell you, the solutions they came up with were equal parts ingenious, desperate, and a little disgusting, basically. The perfect recipe for pirates' survival innovation. Before we dive into the specifics, let's set the scene. These weren't your cozy cruise ships with climate control or even modest cabins where you could catch some heat. Pirate ships like the infamous Queen Anne's Revenge, captained by the legendary Blackbeard in the early 1710s, were built for speed and battle, not for comfort. The decks were open and exposed to the brutal elements, and the crew usually slept in hammocks strung in tight rows right under the main deck's roof. You'd think that at least the wooden structure would offer some warmth, but nope. Wood loses heat faster than a drunken sailor loses his gold coins. Temperatures could plummet to just above freezing, especially in late autumn or on northern routes, and with constant dampness from spray and rain, chills cut through clothes like a cutlass through sailcloth. Now here's where the real kicker comes in. Pirates needed to stay warm, not just comfy warm, but warm enough to avoid hypothermia, frostbite, or at the very least, waking up without feeling like a human popsicle. And all of this without regular fires on board, because, spoiler alert, open flames on a wooden warship filled with gunpowder barrels. Bad idea, really bad idea. So starving for warmth, these guys had to get creative, or as creative as men who lived on salt pork and rum could be. Let's start with their initial attempts, which were, to put it kindly, spectacular failures. As you might guess, pirates first tried the obvious, piling on whatever clothes they had. Unfortunately, their wardrobes were generally limited to rough linen shirts, woolen trousers if they were lucky, and sometimes leather waistcoats. Thick fur coats were mostly a landlubber luxury or noble finery, not pirate gear. Plus, everything aboard got soaked in salt water regularly, which turned those fabrics into freezing wet rags next to the skin. Talk about ruining your fearsome reputation in moist layers of stink and salt. So layering clothes didn't cut it. Pirates found themselves shivering through the night and waking up with fabric stuck to their skin like barnacles to a hull. Not to be outfoxed by nature, some pirates turned to more experimental methods. One of the more bizarre attempts was smuggling barrels of hot coals or embers down into the sleeping areas, hoping the heat would radiate and keep frost at bay. Here's a fun fact. Ships often carried barrels of pitch and tar, highly flammable substances used for sealing hulls, so mixing those with hot coals was like playing pirate roulette. It often resulted in small fires, or at the very least smoke that filled the cramped sleeping quarters, causing everyone to cough like they had just smoked a whole ship's worth of cigars in one go. That method was only about 30% effective because, unsurprisingly, you can't exactly keep red-hot coals rolling under hammocks without burning a hole or two. In a more desperate turn, pirates tried stuffing their hammocks and clothes with straw or seaweed, both of which have some insulating properties. That sounds clever, right? Seaweed especially, since it was readily available and, fun fact, actually does trap air pockets that hold heat. But here's the catch. Seaweed, when wet, is as cold and slimy as it sounds, and straw, when damp from the notorious ship spray, turns into a soggy mess, inviting every species of creepy crawly you didn't want anywhere near your skin. Let's just say it wasn't pretty, and the resulting itchiness and the occasional surprise of wiggling bugs left more than a few pirates questioning their life choices. One famous anecdote from a pirate ship off the coast of Barbados in 1720 tells of a crew who stuffed their clothes with straw aggregates so aggressively that by dawn, half the crew was battling mysterious rashes, and one poor fellow claimed he'd been bit by a dozen tiny devils at once. Spoiler alert. It was just some aggressive sea lice. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Pirates figured out that the key wasn't just adding bulk or random materials. It was about trapping their own body heat efficiently while staying dry, which sounds obvious, but remember, they were working with materials from the 17th and 18th centuries on a rolling naval tug. The real genius was their use of layered clothing combined with a kind of primitive sleeping wrap that smelled less like a pirate's booty and more like thermal science. They'd take oilskins, heavy canvas treated in animal fats or tallow, basically their version of modern waterproof jackets, and layer those on top of wool clothing. Wool was critical because it insulates even when wet, something pirates didn't know but stumbled upon like ancient meteorologists of warmth. These layered oilskins acted like a barrier against wind and moisture, trapping heat, but allowing some breathability so they didn't just sweat it all out and freeze later. It was basically a 17th century thermal insulation sandwich, pirate style. But here's a clever twist: the use of what might seem like an everyday item today, rum. Yes, pirate rum wasn't just for getting lubed up before a fight. Pirates discovered that a moderate swig of rum before bed could help them feel warmer by dilating blood vessels slightly, which boosts blood flow and creates a sensation of warmth. Of course, it's a chemical trick, not actual heat production. Drink too much, and you're just a drunken icicle prone to falling out of your hammock while muttering about treasure maps. Still, with crews often numbering between 50 to 100 men on medium-sized sloops or brigantines, keeping spirits high with rum at night had a morale-boosting effect that went hand in hand with fighting off the cold. On top of clothing and drink, the pirates developed one of their most effective and surprisingly practical innovations: body heat sharing. Notice I said practical and not cuddly. Picture this. In a confined, drafty wooden hold, 50 people stuffed into hammocks hung in tight rows. The only way to avoid shivering into oblivion was to literally pile up and share your body heat. It's not as romantic as the movies make it out to be. Imagine the smell of 100 sweaty men, wet clothes, and unwashed hair all mixed into one giant human heater. But it worked. In fact, according to records from the early 18th century, crews on ships like the Widow, sailing in the North Atlantic, noticed that groups of 8 or 10 huddled together in hammocks had approximately a 70% higher chance of retaining enough body heat through the night than those who tried to go solo. So yeah, pirates accidentally invented group thermal sleeping bags way before merino wool, and synthetic fibers were even a glimmer in a weaver's eye. One historical tidbit that doesn't make it into your average pirate movie is just how strict some captains were about enforcing these cold weather protocols. Blackbeard himself, according to logbooks from 1717, kept a close eye on crews' sleep arrangements during chilly nights off the Carolinas. He mandated that no man was allowed to sleep alone and set rules about rotating which hammocks each night to avoid anybody getting a bad draft or cold spot on the ship's wooden decks. Talk about military precision in managing frostbite risks, because nothing says fearsome pirate captain like a man who micromanages blanket arrangements. You might be wondering about fires again at this point, right? Because nothing says pirate warmth like a roaring fireplace on a ship. But again, open flames were a no-go. Instead, pirates used what are called foot stoves. These weren't much more than small metal boxes filled with embers, safely contained and passed carefully along below decks to warm feet and hands before sleep. Foot stoves were delicate business. Too hot, and you risked burns or smoke inhalation. Too cool, and you were back to freezing piggies. Historical inventories from ships like the Royal Fortune, captained by Bartholomew Roberts, show that such devices were limited in number but considered essential cold weather gear, especially on voyages returning from the bitter North Atlantic routes, where winter snapped harder than a flintlock on Christmas morning. And if you think that's all there was, brace yourself. The pirates even used some natural earth science. Peat moss, which was harvested from coastal marshes and packed onto ships, doubled as an insulator for hammocks and bedding. Peat moss traps air like a sponge and retains some warmth when dry. Pirates didn't know the biochemistry, but they saw it increase their comfort enough to last through spells where the wind chill hovered near freezing. Peat moss was used sparingly because it absorbed water easily, which was a constant battle on the ocean. And as any sailor will tell you, damp insulating materials are worse than none at all. That's just more wet, itchy misery, and not very reassuring when your ship's about to hit a frost-laced gale. So combining all these methods, the layering of wool and oilskins, sharing body heat in hammocks, carefully managing embers in foot stoves, and even boating peat moss for insulation. Pirates managed to survive downright brutal cold nights that would have frozen lesser men solid. It wasn't Hollywood glamorous, but it was effective. And let's be honest, pirates weren't exactly known for luxury. Their solutions might have smelled a bit like a swamp, been a little scratchy, and often included questionable rashes from poorly chosen insulation. But warmth was survival, and survival was the name of the game. Now you might think the story ends there. Pirates just huddled, layered, and hung tight until daylight. But oh no, this was just the beginning. Because as we'll see next, pirates had even wilder tricks up their sleeves, some involving surprisingly advanced chemistry, brutal discipline, and a few downright gross but effective methods that sound like they belong in a medieval torture chamber rather than a pirate ship's cabin. So hold onto your hats, or better yet, your thermal scarves, because the next part will reveal how pirates' battle against the cold was not just about warmth, but about outsmarting nature itself, while being as wonderfully weird as only pirates can be. Alright, now that we've covered the basics, buckle up, because the real pirate cold weather battle was about to get downright weird, and not the charming pirate with a parrot kind of weird. Pirates were desperate enough to dig into some rudimentary chemistry, questionable hygiene, and old-fashioned discipline to keep from turning into a bunch of frozen rags on the ocean. Remember, this was a time when hypothermia was only slightly less feared than the hangman's noose, and frostbite was a one-way ticket to a peg leg or worse. So how did pirates up their game beyond just piling on damp wool and sharing body heat like a huddle of squawking seabirds? Let's dive into the truly bizarre strategies that, well, actually worked. First off, here's something history barely whispers about. Pirates experimenting with primitive chemical treatments to generate heat inside their clothing. No, it's not some lost pirate witch doctor magic. It's all about what we'd call today exothermic reactions. They found that certain minerals mixed with water or air could trigger heat. Think of it like an ancient hand warmer, but way less cozy and a lot more hazardous. Gypsum, that's calcium sulfate, not the stuff your dentist uses. When dampened, releases a small amount of heat. A clever pirate or two figured out that wrapping a patch of gypsum inside a tightly closed cloth near the torso could produce a little warmth. Now, before you start picturing pirates running around with glowing dust, keep in mind the heat output was minimal, and the logistics of packing around damp powder without it turning into a muddy mess posed major challenges. It was about 35% effective at best, but when you're freezing your beard off, that 35% counts. But here's where bad ideas strike again. Some pirates tried to make chemical foot warmers using quicklime, which is basically burned limestone used for cleaning and mortar. Spoiler alert, quicklime reacts with water exothermically, meaning it gets hot enough to cause chemical burns. Pirates would stuff small bags of quicklime into their boots, thinking it would keep their toes toasty. Let's just say it didn't work out so well. Several accounts from the Caribbean in the 1710s complain of crew members hobbling around with blistered feet, swearing off anything that smelled like white devil dust. You can probably guess how that ended. Not with warm feet, but with feet wrapped in vinegar, and a whole lot of swearing. So that was an epic fail, but hey, pirates were not exactly known for being patient scientists. Moving on from chemical stunts, pirates also ramped up their Cold War with personal hygiene, or in this case, the lack of it. Here's the dark truth. Pirates didn't bathe often, and their clothes weren't exactly given hot washes but rather aired out on the rigging during the day. This created a natural layer of grime and oil on their bodies and garments, which actually helped insulate against the cold. Gross but effective. That thin film of grease served as a primitive windbreaker and moisture barrier, preventing skin from losing heat too quickly. It's not exactly the way your mom would suggest staying warm, but for pirates, it was like slipping into a natural thermal suit made from pirate musk. An 18th century naval doctor noted that crews who went ashore more often and washed frequently often suffered more on cold nights than their dirtier shipmates. Talk about ironic hygiene advice. Sometimes filth was literally the best defense against frostbite. But of course, you can't live off grime alone. Pirates needed warmth that could be mobilized quickly and maintained through rolling waves and gusty storms. Enter rum, the liquid gold of pirate life. Not just a morale booster or a way to numb a freshly cut anchor wound, but a temperature trick that worked in one particular way. Drinking moderate amounts of rum before bed caused vasodilation, meaning blood vessels near the skin would open up and give the warm sensation inside. Pirates noticed headaches and shivering sometimes disappeared after a nip or two. Of course, this was a double-edged cutlass. Too much rum actually lowered body temperature in the long run because it made you lose heat faster, turning you into a drunken human popsicle. Still, pirate logbooks from Black Sam Bellamy's crew in 1717 show that regulated rum rations before cold nights saw sickness and frostbite rates drop by nearly 20%. It was basically their version of a pre-sleep warming supplement, just with a risk of falling out of your hammock and waking up in the drink. Next up in the cold-fighting arsenal was the surprising use of enforced physical activity before bunking down for the night. You might think after a grueling day of swashbuckling and plundering, pirates would crash immediately. Nope. Captains like Bartholomew Roberts actually ordered their crews to engage in calisthenics, or even just brisk walking around the deck to boost circulation. Why? Because when your blood is pumping, your extremities stay warmer, which in the freezing, damp night air is the difference between tow loss and survival. Historical journal entries mention crews performing deck drills, almost like early exercise routines to generate warmth, sometimes lasting 15 to 20 minutes before hammocks were even set up. It wasn't exactly a workout class, but it reduced cold risks by around 50% according to such records, considering pirates often had to fight or sail in dawn chills. This warm-up before bed was surprisingly high-tech for seafarers who usually swung more towards sword fighting than sweatbands. And speaking of discipline, the pirate approach to dealing with the cold wasn't just individual. Socially, pirates developed a strict rotation system for sleeping spots and hammock positions to prevent any one sailor from suffering the brunt of cold drafts or damp patches on the wooden deck below. Blackbeard himself, infamous for terrorizing the American eastern seaboard, was known to enforce these rules with military precision. His crew logged temperatures dropping to just above freezing off the Carolina coast, and he mandated that every 2 nights, each pirate rotate hammocks and bedding areas. Why? Because even a thicker woolen blanket wouldn't help if you were bunking directly above a leaking hull joint or a spot prone to sea spray seepage. This rotation improved warm retention chances by nearly 60%, and more than that, it kept crew morale from tanking because nobody wanted to be the cold draft guy 4 nights in a row. Pirates might have been fearsome lawbreakers, but on the cold front, Blackbeard acted like a frostbitten drill sergeant, proving that sometimes empire building really comes down to managing sleeping arrangements. Finally, the true crowning achievement in pirate cold defense was a downright disgusting but highly effective method called bed warming by pest. No, this isn't some weird pirate cuddle party. It's a practice where sailors trapped live small animals, typically rats, yes, the ship's most unwelcome guests, inside pouches slung beneath their hammocks or even inside their jackets overnight. Rats, it turns out, generate a surprising amount of heat, about 10 to 15 watts on average, just from being alive and twitchy. This added subtle warmth helps stave off freezing extremities in the cramped, drafty quarters. Think of it like a furry, squeaky-heated heating pad that occasionally bites your finger. Pirates didn't exactly advertise this tactic, but it's recorded in logs from the ship Fancy, Captain Charles Vane's flagship in 1718. Crews noted a near 45% increase in staying warm during particularly bitter northern passages. Of course, the downside was the occasional bite and the smell, turning sleeping quarters into a delightful mix of body odor, sea salt, and rodent funk. Pretty charming. If your idea of charm is less Caribbean paradise and more end of the world, survival shelter. So putting it all together, pirates living on ships like the Queen Anne's Revenge or the Whydah didn't just deal with the cold by layering clothes or huddling. They improvised with chemical experiments, gambled with fiery coals, smeared themselves with grime for insulation, regulated their sugar rum intake, enforced pre-sleep warm-up drills, rotated sleeping spots like chess pieces, and even welcomed rodents as unexpected heat sources. These solutions were far from perfect, some downright painful or smelly, but survival at sea demanded grit, ingenuity, and a willingness to endure a bit of discomfort, or even significant discomfort.